This week, I would like to. Hold on. This week, I'd like to talk a bit about game design. Specifically, I'd like to talk about Kingdom Party, which is a game I made myself and released on my site. It's available for free. People should check it out. Anyway, I'd just like to talk about the design because I think in my 11-day journal thing, I don't think I talked extensively about all the decisions I made for the game. First thing we need to talk about is actually just how you play the game and what the game is. Kingdom Party is about basically creating an empire and using this empire to collect victory points, which determines who wins the game at the end. In order to help you collect victory points, you have the ability to build cities that'll give you items to help you get advantages on other players. You collect gold to, build cities and buy items. You kill monsters to keep your city safe, collect gold, and you build roads to get around the map quicker. Now that I've defined the basic mechanics and goals of the game, let's talk about my goals when creating Kingdom Party. My goal was to create a game experience that would encourage both cooperation and competition, as sometimes it might be advantageous to help players out, and other times it could end up being best just to screw them over, based off the situation. We'll come back to the cooperation competition thing later. For now, let's talk about the map. I wanted the map to feel somewhat realistic, while maximizing the amount of play space there is. This is why the game world has such a rectangular shape to it. I used squares because, well, it's basically a board game, and I wanted it to be easy to maneuver around. For the area itself, I wanted it divided really into sections. 4 sections, really, because I was going to intend to have 4 players. Of course, I didn't always know if I'd have 4 players, so I made it so that way each of the sections had some sort of purpose beyond just being an area for players. If you choose the single player option, you'll only be playing as the red player and start in one side of the map. The rest of it will have basically nothing else, so you'll be free to basically start small and basically expand in one direction outward. If you have a second player, though, they start approximately on the opposite side of the map and have to expand basically towards you. Inevitably, conflict erupts around the middle areas. Due to the fact that it's a rectangle and not a perfect square, this means that when I add extra players, they're sort of in a bad position, as they're basically where red and blue would end up fighting. To counterbalance this, I started green off in an area where he could easily get to multiple gold mines quickly. This gave green a bit of an economic advantage in terms of how fast he'd be able to get enough money to found his first city and each subsequent city, allowing him to be a force that spreads outward rather than just a force that gets sort of trampled over. Yellow I started up in a bit of a desert area surrounded by mountains, and these mountains give Yellow a natural sort of defensive buffer, keeping him from really being taken in and attacked early on, or really being bothered with, because he has the best natural defense in the game. Or at least I intended him to have the best natural defense in the game. Things generally work that way, but still very possible that you can get booted out of the desert, as I've called it. I knew there wouldn't always be 4 players. Sometimes you'd have to make do with 2 or 3. Or maybe you decide to go on a solo run, just to see how long you could last. The reason I didn't spawn players simply in the 4 corners was just as much about not knowing whether or not there would be 4 players as it was dealing with space issues. If I'd gone in the direction of 4 corners, what would have ended up happening is the 2 players near each other would end up duking it out, while there would just be this giant gap in the middle. And I didn't really like that idea. In addition, if one of the players wasn't there, so if it was a 3-player game, while 2 players would be busy duking it out, the third one could just sort of go everywhere and take over the entire rest of the map. And then we have one player who's pretty much, due to circumstances, really strong, while the other players are not as strong because they've been fighting over resources the entire game. Even if the players who ended up next to each other were smart and tried to move around and head towards that third player to prevent him from really getting as much space as he had, they'd still wind up with the problem of eventually one of them is going to realize that the other one has left their base completely unguarded. And then they're going to go in and take all the resources from that one player. I really didn't want to have that paranoid, oh dear, I'm worried that he's going to come after me, only in this one situation. By spreading them out in a diamond shape, I've ensured that they can use the area around them basically the same way regardless of the amount of players there are. It also let me mess around with what happens when there's less players. As generally, if there isn't actually a player 4, the entire northern desert area just slowly gets swarmed by monsters, which was intentional, hence why I made it the desert. So that way, if you don't get the maximum amount of people, the desert just becomes this inhospitable place that deserts tend to be. It's just, in this case, it's inhospitable because there are monsters everywhere, which leads it to usually being a good spot for players to go and just kill monsters. And one last thing about how player spawns were determined. I set it up so that every player spawns within 3 spaces of a mine, so that way within 3 moves they'll be able to click on a mine and start getting gold from it. This way the first turn in any game is spent moving to that mine and getting some gold. So players start off with a growing economy and can very quickly get what they need to finance the founding of their first city, which is incredibly important. Speaking of mines, I set up mines to be as intuitive to use as possible. You simply walk over it and you click, and you get gold from it. But I didn't want to end up with players just sitting on a mine and sort of camping it, never going to any of the other mines. This is why mines run out of gold. It's so that way you can't stand there and just, keep spamming the mine. You have to go and move and do something else. Whether it's kill monsters or go mine another mine. This helps promote conflict within all the players involved, because when all the mines are exhausted and don't have anything in them, finding mines that have regained gold and becomes very important and very much worth screwing players over. While we're talking about screwing players over, let's talk about the road system. In the initial design for Kingdom Party, there were no roads. I just didn't have them. I wanted it to feel, when you got to the other side of the continent, it was a trek. So I didn't have roads. Unfortunately, when I started playtesting early versions of the game, I realized it was very slow, and the players would never really interact because they were too busy just trying to get somewhere. So I added in roads, which give you a way to move about 3 or 4 times your speed, I've forgotten which, and let you traverse a map and get to all your mines or cities with incredible ease. As an added benefit, roads also make player infighting more commonplace. Because how roads work, you only go fast when you're on them. But if a player is blocking your way, you have to move off them. And usually that's pretty much the end of your turn, is moving off and getting back on. So it leads to a situation of, well, I could try to move around, or I could hit you, which will screw you over later, and convince you to move away. Roads ended up being really, really important to the game, as in addition to letting you move faster, they're also a good marker of how far the game has gone. As early on there are very few roads, and generally they're not connected. But as the game continues, more roads start to pop up, and eventually players start building shortcut routes and extra roads, and slowly the map just gets filled up with roads, representing basically, the height of civilization. Another feature that wasn't planned, but became obviously very necessary, was outposts. And outposts are those little mini cities that you can make. Since cities slowly became more and more expensive to build, but only generate one type of item, getting access to all the items possible is pretty much a matter of luck. I wanted a way to help improve the chances of getting a city that produces the item you want it to make. But I didn't want to make cities cheaper, because more cities means you get better items. And I didn't want players to get items very quickly. So instead, I created outposts, which, they don't give as much money as cities, they don't give any advancements on your tech tree, but they do give you another item, allowing you to have the possibility of getting more items. They're also weaker than cities, but doesn't really matter because you want them so that way you can possibly buy a better item later on. So yeah, they weren't planned, but they worked out very well. Only features I haven't talked about are monsters. There's not much really to say about monsters, though. They really exist to allow players to kill something, so that way they have another source of gold other than mining. They give players another use for all the items, as monster fighting is hard, and if you go into it without having a decent weapon, you're screwed. So there's not really much to say on that front, except I'm not really happy with monsters yet. But I'm probably not going to release another version of the game unless, there's actual outcry. Until then, I think that the game is, right now, pretty solid. It's hard to learn. That's another thing I'd really use working on. Anyway, this has gone on quite a while. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you later, I guess. Bye.